Right, we will continue our discussion, but of course it's going to be in the same line and with the same dilemmas that we're facing and that we can only address by considering different perspectives. Our next panel is titled Europe's New Economic Compass, Balancing Competitiveness, Social Rights and Sustainability. And for that, I am now going to call up the panelists for my panel. You may take your seats in the same way, from left to right. So first, we will greet a corporate lobbyist and manager of government and external relations for a global Japanese electronics company. Please welcome Connor Allen. Take your seat here. Yes. Next up is an associate researcher at CEVIPOL, the Center for the Study of Political Life at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and core team member of the European Social Policy Analysis Network. Please welcome Slavina Spasova. With that. Welcome. We also welcome the head of the Environmental Rights and Rule of Law at Client Earth, an environmental law organization. Please welcome Friel. And the senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center, specialized in Europe's political economy, Dr. Philipp Lausberg. Welcome. Okay, so we will continue to share different views and perspectives on today's topic, and I'd like to start with you, Connor. Competitiveness has become one of the defining themes of the EU's current policy agenda, as we just heard. From your perspective, what does data tell us about the state of the European industry today, and why do you think competitiveness has risen as such a priority?
Thank you very much, Javier. So let me just begin very quickly by addressing the elephant in the room. I am a corporate lobbyist and I do work for a large global multinational. Normally that means I'm designated as the bad guy on a panel discussion.
Welcome.
So let me begin by saying I come in peace. I come in peace because even though I come from an industry point of view, I want exactly the same as the most radical trade unionist or the most radical NGO worker here in the audience. I want a healthy, happy and thriving Europe, and I want a healthy, happy, thriving European. So I think that's something we can all agree on. And sometimes it's very important that we can remind ourselves we are all on the same team, ultimately. But that being said, let me start off with an unescapable and unavoidable truth. You cannot build a house without a foundation, and you cannot build social protections without prosperity. Without a competitive Europe, there is no social Europe. It does not exist. If European businesses are not thriving, there are no trade union members because there's no employees to join them. If European businesses are not thriving, then there are no NGOs because the rules they advocate for, enacted through a single market, loses all its power and influence if it is not strong enough. So let's take that single market for a second, which is something I want to focus on, because I want to impress on everybody in this room, if you take away one thing from this weird British corporate lobbyist, it's that we are in a crisis, and we need to be raising the alarm. Javier, you asked about the state of European industry, and I'm sorry to say, it's total crisis, and you can see that when you focus on the single market. I was born in 1992, and in my lifetime, the share of the world market that Europe occupies has declined from 25% on the year of my birth to 13% today. We are a smaller and less important market, relatively. The average European has gone from having 80% of the purchasing power adjusted output of the average American in 1992 to about 68% today. So we're a poorer market, relatively. And Europe is constantly outpaced by its competitors in the United States and China in every metric that deals with innovation. We have 110 unicorns compared to the US's 680. We have our R&D spend is a fraction of Chinese and US spending. So we're a less dynamic market, relatively speaking. And we're seeing the full effects of this play out. If there's any Germans in the room, you're going to know that Volkswagen is announced 50,000 job cuts last month, and potentially that will increase to 100,000. But I can name you so many others, so many stories of European decline. Bosch, 13,000 job cuts. ThyssenKrupp, 11,000. Nestle, 16,000. Continental, 10,000. Daimler, 7,000. Lufthansa, 4,000. If any of you believe that Europe's economy is not in crisis, go to the families of the 340,000 workers whose jobs have disappeared in Germany alone since 2019. Tell them that the economy is not in crisis, and you're going to get a much less polite response than I'm going to give you here. But it's not just in Germany, it's all across Europe, and this is a statistic that's repeated. 1 million jobs disappeared between 2019 and 2023, and the European Commission itself says that 27,000 jobs per month are lost now. Per month. That's insane numbers. And look beyond the job losses themselves. The factories that remain open, and many of them are closing, are not working at full capacity across every sector, and most businesses, and that means that we are not in a good place. It's a dangerous position to be in. Take automotive. 10% of Europe's economic output, and the average factory operates at 33% capacity. That's not a good statistic. It means you don't have enough demand for your products. It heralds more job losses in the future. You ask me what the data tells us about the state of European industry. It's very clear. Those numbers, quite frankly, are apocalyptic. And that is why competitiveness has risen so high on the agenda. That's why it's receiving all the political attention, at least in this European Commission mandate.
Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into that diagnosis, if you will. What, in your view, are the main obstacles for the European industry not to be able to compete on the same level as its global competitors, and what kinds of changes in the policies would you advocate for?
Sure. I mean, so many obstacles. But if you're asking me what we're going to do to fix the European decline, I think the easiest route, the most low-hanging fruit, is deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. And I see a few people wanting to boo and hiss at me, and a few people who want to burst into applause there, and that's okay. But look, there's not just one obstacle. It's a whole host of issues we have here. The foundations upon which the European economy is built on are, quite frankly, rotten. I call them the three prime evils that are affecting our industry: overregulation, overtaxation, and high energy costs. And one that started to emerge as a fourth evil in the last year or so is geopolitical risk, which we're all very aware of. Ultimately, we have historic high energy costs, we have historic high labour costs, and we have historic high taxes. That's not a great combination. But it's the regulation that really gets to Europe. So I've worked for Japanese companies for a while now, and every so often there is a phrase that gets picked up in Japanese media, that gets reported back to us. The phrase of the last few years has been European regulatory tsunami. But I mean, Japan's its own case, but maybe let's take California as a helpful comparison, because California is largely, in a broad set, facing similar issues to Europe. Its energy prices are double that of most states in the United States. It almost reaches European levels sometimes. Its labour costs are extremely high. It's very highly taxed. The highest rate of tax in California is 53%, and if you live in Belgium, you will know that number quite well. But despite these, California is booming. California has a booming tech sector, and it has the economic output of France and Poland combined, or Italy and Spain combined. Why is it so much more prosperous than Europe? Well, the difference is the compliance burdens attached to regulation, which I'm going to focus on. And by regulation, as we were saying before, I don't mean a race to the bottom. I mean fewer duplicative reporting obligations, fewer overlapping audits, fewer rules that measure process rather than output, and fewer situations where compliance becomes an industry in itself. Californian companies, for example, do not have to geoplot the precise plot of land where the rubber in their supply chain comes from. Each company in Europe has to comply with hundreds of pieces of legislation at the EU level alone, not to mention the national level regulation. Most of that regulation has been passed in the last 10 years, and that's why the Japanese call it a regulatory tsunami. Sometimes, for those not working in business or industry, it's very hard to quantify what that means in terms of the compliance costs. I mean, if you think of what you have to do to comply with this, it's investments in IT systems, external legal advice, consultancy, translation services, audits, operational costs, staffing decisions. You have to employ people like me to go and lobby. I'm not productive. I don't make anything. I don't sell anything. I shouldn't have a job, but yet, because of this, I do. So maybe I shouldn't criticize too hardly. And guess what as well? I don't do the compliance. For every person like me, there are 30 employees working full-time on compliance. But let me give you some concrete numbers. So there's a big ESG management platform established in 2024, estimated that the cost of complying with Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, about 287,000 euros one-off cost and about 320,000 annual costs after that. And that's just one piece of legislation. The Working Time Directive, 673,000 euros in compliance costs according to Business Europe. Pay Transparency Directive, 531,000 euros, an annual cost of 685,000. So I've named just 3 pieces of legislation there, and together they total around 1.5 million in upfront costs and annual costs in 1 million on top of that. How many workers can you employ? How many machines can you buy? How much innovation can you fund with that money? Quite a lot, actually. It's not sustainable by any metric, and it's strangling the prosperity of businesses in the EU. And I think I've had my time, so I'll leave it there.
All right. No, thank you very much for that perspective. I think your alarm bell was very well heard. I'd like to bring in Slavina now. A few years ago, the European pillar of social rights was the highest priority in the agenda. Today, as we have heard, it is competitiveness that has moved to the forefront. Now, if we take a look at the report State of Play 2025 by ETUI, that's the European Trade Union Institute, that gives a perspective from employment, if you will. It argues that competitiveness has become too narrow a lens for thinking about economic success. So if that is the case, what indicators should policymakers be looking at instead?
Благодаря първо за поканата. Благодаря на организатора.
First of all, thank you for the invitation and the organizers. I'd like first to say a few words in Bulgarian.
But because many years ago I wrote a PhD in French at Université Libre de Bruxelles on the Europeanization of Bulgarian social policies, including a case study on the Bulgarian Economic and Social Committee. So it's really important for me being here. But now going back to your question. Indeed, what I will be telling you is based on this report, which is a report we publish every year, the European Social Observatory and the European Trade Union Institute. So it's not only my own views. I really think it's important to say. And our main question was whether social Europe can become resilient by design. A very difficult question, and I'm happy you mentioned the European Pillar of Social Rights, because indeed, since 2017, the European Pillar of Social Rights became the main compass for social policies at EU level. And if we look at the 20 principles of the pillar, we see that they are almost all covered now by either hard legislation, soft law, or some strategies and plans. And so we saw that during this decade, which was called even the Roaring 20s, there has been really a move towards a more rights-based approach. Let's just think of the historic Adequate Wage Directive, but also of some difficult-to-imagine areas which were covered by soft law, only soft law, let's say, but still important, like long-term care, access to social protection for non-standard workers and the self-employed, just transition, etc. However, and what we've been observing at EU level is that this compass is harder and harder to find. Faced with geopolitical risks that we heard about this morning, fast digitalization, the dominant narrative, even in the area of social Europe, became competitiveness. And please don't get me wrong. Obviously, Europe needs competitiveness. Nobody argues against that. But some situations, I believe, are deeply troubling because macroeconomic indicators are improving. We see employment is up, GDP is recovering, while real wages in several member states remain below pre-pandemic levels, child poverty is rising even in some countries, and housing is increasingly out of reach, especially for younger generations. And this is a kind of decoupling that we see. Macroeconomy and people's lived experiences sometimes move in opposite directions. And what we also observe is that social policies at EU level are increasingly linked to skills, revolve around the mantra of skills, which is obviously important. But what really worries me is that the pillar, so the narrative of the pillar itself, is much less present in EU discourse, and its revised action plan that we've been expecting keeps being postponed. But so now, going back to your particular questions on which areas and indicators need to be covered, I thought of 4 ones. The first one is job quality. So we need to look not only at employment rates. High employment figures can mask obviously very precarious situations, right? Such as precarious contracts, unpredictable working hours, also psychosocial risk, people, and especially young people, not in education, employment, or training. And we need to look even more at indicators such as real wage growth, in-work poverty, gender pay, but also gender pension gaps, bargaining coverage, etc. And there are, I would say, some really encouraging signs, such as the Job Quality Initiative, now the Job Quality Roadmap, let's see, with the Job Quality Act. And for instance, let's see legislative initiatives such as the AI at work, rights to disconnect, etc., to be seen. The second very important area, I think, it's social investment across the life course. And what we've seen in our report, and what is really reassuring, is that this paradigm remains central to the EU. It's visible in the Union of Skills, it's visible in the anti-poverty strategy, the housing plan, and more generally through the life course approach of the European Pillar of Social Rights. It's also visible now in the EU governance, especially through the newly established social convergence procedure. However, again, there is a risk that it's narrowed down the social investment approach only to skills and labor supply, especially now when the post-pandemic instruments are phased out. And we all remember, maybe several of us remember these discussions on including the social investment in the EU, in the reform of the EU economic governance 2 years ago, especially under the Belgian presidency. And also now, it was already mentioned, the new MFF discussions. The third policy area, I would like, by the way, to ask you the question. Do you remember that the first von der Leyen Commission political guidelines theorized, conceptualized 3 transitions, the green, the digital, and which one? Do you remember which was the third transition? No.
Social?
I think it's normal that you don't remember because it's been really absent as such in EU discourse. It's the demographic one. And we haven't been talking a lot about that. Me, for years, I worked on pensions, on long-term care, and I said, what about these demographic transitions? We all forgot about that. And we looked into EU discourse on instruments, and it's really very interesting. In 2023, the Commission published the Demography Toolbox. This year, has somebody heard of the intergenerational fairness strategy? It was published in March this year. And so these are very... No.
A little bit of nodding at least.
Yeah, these are very important documents, I think, because they try to make a coherent narrative of what the EU considers as a demographic transition, with a very strong accent on younger people, and especially they plead for an intergenerational fairness, a new intergenerational fairness contract. We need there obviously more interinstitutional coordination, adequacy indicators related to demography and not only fiscal sustainability ones. And there is a lot to be explored in this area. And finally, let's not forget the policy of gender. All these transitions, these three transitions, have been largely gender blind. We really see it to a certain, to a different extent. So to conclude, taken together, competitiveness is obviously not the wrong goal. But only a fair and socially sustainable Europe can be resilient in the future. And given the political context, I believe that new legislation will be harder and harder to achieve. Let's see what happens with the Job Quality Act, etc. There has been also something like a social Europe fatigue in terms of legislation. And so I believe that, therefore, there is also a moment to strike a balance between a new legislation and the real implementation and enforcement of previous one over the past 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are having a look and an analysis of what the EU's agenda is currently pushing for. If I understood correctly, you're concerned that the indicators may not be the right ones. Europe's trade unions are critical of the EU simplification agenda. What concerns you most about it, if you share that view?
Well, let me be clear from the outset. Nobody, including the trade unions, argue against clearer, simpler, and workable rules, right? Simplification is legitimate and can even support social and environmental goals. And the simplification agenda of the EU is so complex, so we asked in our report representatives from the European Trade Union Confederation who have a strong legal background to explain in a chapter what it is about. So I will basically now present their views and then some more general recommendations. You know, the most discussed package was the omnibus package, was the sustainability one, including the due diligence directive, corporative sustainable reporting directive, etc. And these are not pieces of red tape. They were hard-won social achievements to make companies accountable for their impacts on workers, communities, and environment across chains. And what the unions are really very much concerned about, there are three main concerns. The first one is procedural. Several recent packages have moved through accelerated procedures with compressed impact assessments, and they believe they were much less consulted than business. The second concern is about legal uncertainty. You know, bundling many changes into single packages makes harder for everybody, workers, small enterprises, civil society, to grasp the cumulative effects on their rights and obligations. And the third and deepest concern of the unions is political and more broadly democratic. The omnibus, they believe, has been pushed through in ways that don't comply with the Commission's better regulation guidelines. There has no full impact assessment that has been conducted according to them. And the consultation process was hasty, as I already mentioned, and they don't feel they were genuinely consulted. And so, regarding some recommendations which we took out of the chapter, they argue for balanced stakeholders consultations, full ex-ante impact assessments, not only on compliance costs, but also on long-term economic and social sustainability, as well as it's really important also to have impact assessments on the cost of inaction, not only of action. Then there are pleas for real democratic scrutiny by the European Parliament and the social progress test. Before any simplification measure, they argue that there is a genuine assessment on vulnerable groups, for instance. And something more personal as a recommendation to the unions, I would say that it's also time for unions to even enhance better their expertise, because this is a very complex area, in order to be real interlocutors with two policymakers. And expertise obviously is not only it's not enough. It's very important to create a real social movement and alliances with different actors, civil society, but also with employers. So that's it.
All right, that is very much food for thought. And I saw Anna nodding quite often while you were speaking. I'm assuming there are some shared positions there. Client Earth has been highly critical of the Commission's recent simplification agenda. What are your organization's main concerns? And could you give us some concrete examples on what you think is at stake here? I hope so.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I mean, our concerns are very similar to the unions as well. So I think we'll cover some similar ground. But first of all, it's very important for me to say, because I'm an environmental lawyer. 80% of my colleagues are lawyers. We work with the law every day. We are not fundamentally against simplification. We need laws to be workable, effective, and implemented and implementable for them to work. So. That's certainly not our concern, and no one should be burdened with red tape. But the problem is that what we've been seeing is simplification presented. However, it's really the weakening of substantive environmental and social protections. And this transfers the burden of the costs onto people and onto future generations. So yes, I have read the future generation strategy as well. And this is being done through processes that bypass the democratic safeguards that underpin EU decision making, so transparency, public participation, and a solid evidence base. And these are principles that are in the EU treaties. Article 10 of the Treaty on European Union makes a normative choice for participative democracy at EU level, and this is really being sidelined at the moment. So really we have two concerns, is that how these changes are being made, but also what the changes mean in practice and what is at stake. So I'll start with the how. So over the last 2 years, we've seen about 10 omnibus legislative proposals being fast-tracked under the banner of simplification, competitiveness, and urgency. And the Commission has completely departed from its own better regulation rules, which require robust impact assessments and public consultation. And these are not just nice-to-haves, as I said. You know, they really guarantee that EU legislation is based on solid evidence of the long-term impacts on people, businesses, human rights, climate goals, etc. And that they are informed by the lived experience and the opinions of Europeans. But not one of the last 10 omnibuses has followed these. Yeah, as Slavina has said, you know, climate consistency checks and impact assessments were omitted, public consultations bypassed, and a lot of the key decisions that were made by the Commission when putting together these legislative proposals were really influenced by certain business industry interests and excluded civil society voices. And yeah, well, these are not only our concerns with other civil society actors. We also brought these to the Ombudswoman, and she found maladministration in the way that the Commission had handled major legislative files like the Common Agricultural Policy Reform, which was just slipped into in the last Commission, which kind of heralded what was going to come with the new Commission, and the omnibus packages. So in April, the Commission kind of responded to these criticisms of the Ombudsman by adopting a new better regulation communication. And I think it's important to be really clear that these rules are weaker than their predecessors. So we really are seeing very concrete backsliding on democratic accountability at EU level, as if we can afford that. So they allow the Commission greater discretion to avoid impact assessments and public consultations on the basis of urgency, which is a very highly subjective notion. And so the Ombudswoman has reacted by saying that she's going to maintain her scrutiny of how the Commission is exercising its legislative function, because there really aren't sufficient safeguards in place anymore. Nevertheless, with the communication, the Commission did kind of renew its commitment to impact assessments and public consultations as the rule. And we're really hoping that this will mark a change of direction away from the practices of the last 2 years. But ultimately, process matters so much because it impacts and it shapes the outcomes, and that brings me to what is really at stake here. So I'm going to talk about one example briefly, which is the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, which is also mentioned by my colleague here, which is one of the pieces of legislation that was really, I would say, gutted through the first omnibus proposal. But there are many examples out there of the omnibuses taking away substantive environmental protections under the guise of simplification. So the CSDDD, as it's known, it was a landmark Green Deal law. It requires large companies to identify, prevent, and address human rights abuses and environmental harms throughout their value chains. And it required companies to adopt and implement climate transition plans. So this kind of comes back to what the first panel was talking about, is it enough for consumers to know? I would say no, it's not enough for consumers to know. There actually has to be regulation in place so that companies can transition to a more sustainable way of business. And this is what the CSDDD was trying to do. And so the first omnibus, first of all, it just radically reduced the pool of companies that this applies to, and it completely deleted climate transition plans. And the justification for that in the Commission's proposal was that this was administration and red tape. This is actually a core obligation and a core component of the Green Deal. So what does this mean for Europe? If companies are no longer required to account for the environmental and human rights harms linked to their supply chains, then the risks are actually borne by other people. It's borne by workers who are facing exploitation, communities affected by pollution, sacrifice zones, deforestation, and then ultimately all of us and our children and our children's children who are all facing the impacts of climate change. And then what about climate transition plans? So the EU has put in place climate goals. We know that to meet them, there has to be a transition for the way that we do business. We can't continue to rely on a model that where consumers consume at Primark. It's not sustainable. So this obligation has been ripped out without an impact assessment, so without actually having the evidence base for that decision. This is one example. There are many others. Our message is a simple one. If we really need to change legislation, let's do it in the European way, based on democracy, supported by robust evidence, by inclusive participation. And let's look at what really matters as well, rather than looking for solutions where they don't exist.
You mentioned the word urgency quite a few times during your intervention, and I think that, of course, also maybe goes hand in hand with the notion that we heard at the beginning, that this is a time for very quick action. What would you propose to make European companies more competitive in the global economy without compromising the environmental protections that the EU has put in place?
Well, as I said, I'm an environmental lawyer, so I'm not a business person or an economist, but I'll give you my take on this. I think it's clear from what we've heard this morning from the first panel and also from our very interesting keynote speaker this morning that Europe's competitiveness problems are due to huge shifts in how the global economy works. So it's understandable in this context of such geopolitical instability and economic pressure that there's a temptation to reach for rash rash solutions and listen to the loudest voices as well, and those that are invited into the room. But slashing environmental and social safeguards is not the answer, in my opinion. I mean, even the OECD has confirmed that red tape over the last 15 years has not actually increased that much for Europe, certainly not in a way that can account for the loss of competitiveness. And democracy, transparency, and evidence-based policy making are not barriers to competitiveness. Huh? It's what makes European regulation credible and durable. So I know at the moment the economic costs of staying within 2 degrees of global warming and avoiding ecosystem collapse seem too high, extremely high, too high to pay. But they are significantly lower than inaction. And that's because a stable climate and a healthy environment are the bedrock of what allows businesses to do business into the future. We should be really thinking about energy resilience, food resilience, and how we can actually sustain our way of producing into the future. And it's sure that this can't be done without regulation. So the question isn't whether we regulate, it's how we regulate, which has been said already before this morning as well. Otherwise, I mean, I think the way we're doing this now is absolutely the wrong way to do it. It's creating legal uncertainty, it's creating instability for business, for public authorities, and for civil society alike.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring in Philipp now. We just heard different perspectives, not only here, but throughout the morning, from industry, from trade unions, and from civil society. Now, briefly stepping back from those viewpoints for a more general perspective, how do you assess the state of Europe's economy and its prospects in this very competitive environment? Is Europe, when you look at figures, really falling behind that badly? Is it as critical as we have heard today? And if so, where do you see it most clearly?
Yes, so my overall assessment is that the EU economy is still strong, but our relative competitiveness is eroding. And that's mainly because the global environment has changed faster than our economic model. And at the same time, Europe has the potential to do very well as long as it adopts the right reforms. Mainly, these are laid out in the Draghi report, but I'll come back to that a bit later. To start with the good news, Europe still remains the world's second largest economic bloc. It's the largest trading power and therefore also has leverage. It has a highly skilled workforce, strong manufacturing capabilities, excellent research, global leadership in many green and industrial technologies. It has strong rule of law, predictability, strong social model. And these are an asset in an increasingly unstable, unpredictable world. But the world has changed fundamentally. And Europe's growth model rests basically on assumptions that are no more. And that's number one, cheap energy from Russia mainly. Number two, open export markets, mainly China, based on free global trade. And number three, a rules-based international order guaranteed by a US security umbrella. So all of that is basically gone. And now we're facing, geopolitical fragmentation and wars. We're facing the weaponization of economic relations. We can see that with US tariffs. Trump always uses tariffs as his main threat when he wants anything. But also the weaponization of dependencies as part of, for example, on energy, on raw materials, on demand, on markets. So that's China mainly, but also others, like Russia. And then finally, very importantly also, increasing role of the state in the economy. So we have massive industrial subsidies as part of an escalating technological and industrial competition, particularly in China. And these subsidies that China uses, and it makes it very clear in its 5-year plans, are aimed at making China less dependent on the world and the world more dependent on China. It's really aimed at taking over entire value chains. So this is not free market economy anymore. This is about taking over markets. This is geopolitics. And we've seen that, for example, the overcapacities that they produced. For example, the solar industry used to be mainly dominated by European players. They completely wiped that out because of subsidies and the lack of trade defense in Europe. And in this new environment, Europe's relative position is really deteriorating. We're seeing, and I think I don't need to repeat what my colleague Connor said before, we see deindustrialization, we see job losses, and as Mario Draghi put it, Europe really risks slow agony if it does not update its economic model to these new realities. And the main issue here, I think, why we are not doing what it takes right now is that Europe is not leveraging its size. So one of the reasons why the US is ahead in productivity, which is the main measurement that Draghi uses to explain the difference in competitiveness, is that the US has large tech companies. And that's something they have because of their size, because of their big market, but also because of their large investment power. And we see our single market is a great asset, but it's too fragmented. So strategic sectors, energy, digital, defense, services, capital markets, professions, all of them are incompletely integrated. We are facing single market barriers that the IMF estimated at 44% between EU countries for goods and more than 100% for services. So there's a lot of work to do there. And that, of course, makes it harder for businesses to scale across the European Union, to achieve the scale and the size, the economies of scale, to compete with the US and China. And the single market could also increase demand in the EU and make us less dependent on these export markets like in China. And it could also make us less dependent on products that are produced elsewhere, because we could then also, it would be easier to produce more in Europe itself. And linked with this single market problem is the scale-up gap that Europe has. So we have great research, we have great universities, great startups, but then we are not so good at commercializing them, in scaling them up, because a lot of them then look for finance elsewhere in the United States and they'll leave. And linked to that, of course, is the famous investment gap that Draghi also talks about. He talks about, 800 billion that we're lacking every year. The ECB talks about 1.2 billion that we're lacking for defense, for green, and for digital alone. And this is something that needs fixing, of course. And I think what's important to know, of course, is the United States has integrated capital markets. They're much deeper. They can produce deep, large ticket, long-term financing. We have 27 different markets. So if we can integrate them, that is a very urgent step forward. But also large public investment in industrial policy that is coordinated, it's long-term, and it's well-targeted, like China does, for example, but increasingly also the United States. That is something Europe is not so good in. And I think, we, for example, looking at US public R&D expenditure, it's pretty much the same like in Europe, but it has a much higher share of federal funding, and that makes all the difference, whereas we duplicate our funding across member states. So more EU-level funding, or at least more coordinated national member state funding, would be absolutely crucial to get ahead here. And then, of course, the high energy prices keep being a huge obstacle to European competitiveness. And especially for industry, where Europe is, traditionally strong. And there we really need to talk about energy market integration, grid integration, but also investments in clean tech. And we will have to use industrial policy as well, like everyone else does. We cannot say the Americans are now the free market power. They're not using it. They are. We saw the IRA. We see Trump taking equity stakes in chips companies, in rare earth mines, and so on. Then we have the demographic change that we heard about that comes along with a skills shortage that businesses are suffering from. And of course, the regulatory burden. I can dwell on that a bit later. But I think what's also crucial, and it's my final point here, we need to have a stronger trade defense. We cannot, play by the rules if everyone doesn't. We need to be realistic about Chinese overcapacities that are literally, destroying a lot of our industries. And the reaction of the EU so far has been product by product. 1 year of investigations, and then finally you have some tariffs against Chinese EVs. The Chinese just changed their production lines to hybrid cars, and they're now flooding our market with that. We are way too slow, and you know, as we've heard, industrial jobs, industries are dying by the month. We need to act quickly, and for that, the EU needs to have a much more concerted approach. It needs an EU equivalent to the United States Section 301 trade instrument that basically allows a quick trade defense measures against entire sectors if European industries are under attack. So this is very much about leveraging our size. It's also maybe about a discussion: should we still have, you know, a unanimity in the Council for a lot of areas? And I think with enlargement, that discussion only becomes more pertinent. Maybe a final point on partnering. We need to find new partners as well. More FTAs, more free trade agreements. This is something that's already happening, where the Commission, I think, is doing a relatively good job. I think it needs to be a little bit more also on investment and on industrial cooperation to coordinate industrial policies, not just trade, and also economic security cooperation. But these are a lot of places where a lot of work needs to be done if we want to stay competitive and if we don't want to lose our prosperity, which of course is one of the main promises of the European Union.
Of course, the question is whether the measures that are being taken right now take all of that into consideration and move us in that direction. Looking at evidence and considering that the Commission is putting competitiveness and simplification of regulatory burdens, as you would call them, at the center stage, do you think that is the right diagnosis and also the right remedy for the problems that the... You
mean simplification?
Yes.
Well, I think simplification is part of the answer. It's an important, obstacle to competitiveness. The European Commission, said the costs, the compliance costs for administrative and regulatory burdens amount to over 100 billion euros annually. It's an equivalent of around 0.9% of European GDP. So that is significant. That's something that is important. We've heard, also in the previous panel, some examples. Some, especially smaller companies, they have to pay up to 5% of their, of their income on compliance. So that's serious. We need to address that. But it's not the only thing where we need to act. And to be honest, it's not going to do the trick alone. There is a Bloomberg study that said, looking at Germany's economic problems right now, it is 40% Chinese overcapacities, 40% the energy price, and only 20% the regulatory burden. So it is important, but we shouldn't overstate its importance compared to the other factors that I mentioned. And but yeah, I mean, the Commission's effort, 25% cutting that, I think it's the right goal. And of course, you need to be careful to not create more complexities, to make things, as we've heard before, more difficult, and also to undermine the common goals that we have. I think it would be better to then maybe retract from some of the goals, rather than undermining those goals by cutting down on regulation. So you need to find the right way to keep the predictability that Europe offers to businesses in place, because that's something that also in our global context that is more and more erratic, this is an asset and we should keep that. But what's being done good, I think, is more proportionality. I think there's no point in having like very heavy regulation on small and mid-sized companies, SMEs, and mid-caps, and that's something the Commission has now also put in place, a new mid-cap category that has some, less burdens. But I think a very important lever here is digitalization, to make sure that regulation can be more easily done through digital tools, through AI, and there's the single digital gateway, the European business wallet that the European Commission is pushing ahead. It takes too much time. There needs to be more help also for some countries. They can't afford that, or they don't have the technological knowledge. There's a lot to do there. And finally, I think what's important, if we talk about simplification, if we talk about getting rid of red tape, then we need to talk about completing the single market again. Because if you have 27 different laws and you replace them by one European one, it makes life so much easier for a lot of companies that do business around Europe. So I think that is key, and that means investing also in more single market enforcement, making sure that member states don't gold plate. That means adding additional barriers. And it means also helping countries that might not have the expertise or the funds, also often in Central Eastern Europe, with technical support, with funding also from the European Commission. But altogether, I think simplification is not the only solution. What's even more important, I think, is more investment in innovation, in key technology, in industry, in infrastructure. It's combining that with demand measures, I think, with public procurement, also some made in Europe provisions there, and a robust trade policy that I mentioned before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've heard many ideas, many impulses. We would like to hear from you, of course. We will have time for just a few questions before I release you into the lunch break. We're going to start right here in the front. And reminding everybody to please be as concise as you can with the questions and the answers so we can get in as many as possible.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
My name is Maria Mincheva. I'm Bulgarian. As you can guess by the name, I represent employers group in the ESC. I also represent one of the employers' organizations in Bulgaria. And as you can imagine, in our national context, cutting red tape is also very, very high on the political agenda. I want to share some insights very briefly, although I will start in 2020, on the 8th of March 2020, just before COVID made us all stay home and all the economy be locked down. I was in Brussels, where there was a Business Europe Day, and it was at the very beginning of the mandate of the Commission led by Ms. von der Leyen, her first mandate, where there was a presentation of the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal was supposed to be the new growth strategy for Europe. Now, 6 years later, figures say this was not achieved. And because it was mentioned by some of the panelists at OECD said that there was no red tape increase in Europe, I wanted just to quote a few things from their report, Smart Regulation, Strong Business, where the OECD notes that the overall trajectory of global regulatory landscape points to steadily expanding regulatory stock and growing complexity. There is an excessive burden. The OECD openly states that governments and business alike agree that regulatory burdens have become excessive, and in a survey in its member states, over 80% of business organizations reported that regulatory requirements and compliance are now one of the top 3 most significant challenges that they face, ranking way ahead of other issues like talent acquisition or geopolitical instability. Impact on productivity. The OECD explicitly connects this growing web of red tape to negative economic outcomes, warning that it is actively shifting economic dynamism and dragging down productivity growth. And as I was listening to the debate until now, I have the feeling that I listened to a regulatory board, and that all of my colleagues or speakers, if they could, they would adopt more and more regulations, thinking that this would bring more welfare or better protection. I hope at the end of this day, we could have some joint understanding that business is acting in a very, very complex situation, and handling this complex regulation does not mean they will deliver more. It means businesses will deliver less. So please, I know we come from different perspectives, but we need to go out of the Brussels bubble, where we speak of simplification, go outside on the street and ask people if they know our policy debate, our main policy pointers that we all have here, because we go to Brussels, and whether we wish it or not, we go into this discussion, but this is so far away from the people, and I know that in order to be able for the European Union to deliver, we need to speak on the language of people, and this includes businesses across all Europe as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I guess if that was a statement, no, not necessarily a question. If someone else, but thank you very much for that. If anyone else has a question that you'd like to ask to one of the panelists, you may raise your hand. Don't be shy. All right. Okay. Oh, there's one question there.
Thank you. This is Sebastian Rodriguez from the European Movement International. And I've got a question, since probably it's less about policy, more about communications for the colleagues from Client Earth, but also extensible to everyone else. And it's, to me, it's very clear that this frame that Connor has smartly put at the beginning of his intervention about simplification is simplification as being inherently good. And the first thing that you have said when responding to him was, I'm not against simplification, right? So trying, like, sort of acknowledging that frame, that simplification in itself is good, right? And then you argue within it. What would be like the narrative that you would think would work best with people to say, we are, I think you talk at the end about our children's future and what we are doing to leave them a better planet. So what would be like a narrative that doesn't include simplification, that would explain better what's, your position, what's your proposal for sustainability, like of our society, our companies, etc. I'm just curious about how you communicate about that without repeating Connor's framework, which it seems to me to be the dominant, right? So how do we counterbalance that?
Would anyone of you take that? Maybe, so the question, if I might sum it up, is basically what narrative can work. If not, we require simplification, if that's not the correct one. What narrative would work for people when you talk about where we should be heading, considering that the narrative now seems to be we are complicated in regulations and we have to simplify them?
First of all, I do really mean it when I say that I think that there needs to be simplification, and that often, is this on? And often EU regulation is not perfect, and the way that it's, especially the way it's rolled out in the member states, creates a lot of complications. I mean, just now there's a huge wave of trying to simplify permitting, for example, and I agree that permitting is overly complicated, it takes too long, and that for example, the public authorities dealing with it don't have the resources to do it quickly, and I'm just saying that sometimes the way in which it's done is not done with a view to long-term sustainability, so really ensuring that when we're taking decisions, we're taking into account what are the long-term impacts of what we're doing for the next generation. What could work? I mean, I think what we're seeing just now when we talk about, when we're seeing the simplification that's happening just now and some of the really key environmental protections that we're losing, is that the impact that it's going to have on health and on our health systems in the future. For example, in the food and feed omnibus, if they're taking away basically the obligation to keep up with the best available science when we're approving pesticides, and the science is changing all the time, and the risks are becoming clearer and clearer all the time, for example, on the PFAS that are in pesticides. And now we're going to move to a model where we approve it once and for all. Yeah, that's super simple, I agree. It removes a lot of burden. But what about the impacts on that as we're spraying it all over our fields on our health, and what's going to happen on the health costs that we're all going to have to incur? And that's what I mean about shifting the burden onto taxpayers who are paying for the health systems. So I think that looking really at the impacts that it has on individuals, on our daily lives, and on the lives of our children is a powerful narrative to ensure that we take the decisions that we need to make sure that basically we're not going to see ecosystem collapse in the next 10 years and extreme heat. Like we've just seen now, we're really seeing the impacts of climate change and affecting all of our lives. We're so terribly unprepared for it, as we all saw 2 weeks ago. So yeah, I'm happy to.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you touch on that briefly? Or no? Okay. No, I think that's all we have time for. so because I have to look at the clock. So if you want to touch on that briefly, you may. Oh, okay. Well, if you can, then you wanted to reply to Philipp.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important question, and it's extremely important to listen to social partners, and you as a representative from the employers from Bulgaria, and you rightly refer to the Brussels bubbles discussion sometimes. And here what I really believe is important is that we perform this process of simplification not in a way that there is not a downgrading of social rights and in a democratic process, and then the details is to be seen, but it's very important to do that, but it's not, we shouldn't make more obstacles to simplification, so obviously, and here what Philipp referred to very often was the Draghi report, but implicitly you referred a lot to the Enrico Letta report, and I think there are also very interesting ideas on how to complete the single market, as you discussed, and it could be some of the responses to your question as well.
Thank you very much. I am very sorry, but looking at the time and at our hunger levels, I think I will have to release you into the lunch break. So I would like to thank my panelists and my experts who will be around, so you can also ask them your questions directly. This applause is for you. Thank you so much.